I'm heading back to my folks' place starting tomorrow. It was my once-in-a-lifetime breakout moment. It was my declaration that I'd had it up to here with my husband. Depending on whether he took my words to heart and did some soul-searching, or brushed me off like he always did, I planned to chart my next move. No kidding, this could be a major fork in the road, a real game-changer for his life from here on out. That's how dead serious I am now. That's how ticked off I am at him. But without even glancing my way, he stayed glued to the TV. Some variety show was on, and he spat out.
I'm wiped. Don't talk to me. The work I'm doing is a whole other ballgame from your chores. After all, I'm clocking time at another firm to become the next CEO. With those words, it was a done deal. I decided to let him taste hell, the special brand of hell I'd cooked up just for him. The reason I married him was because of our connection through the company his old man ran. I'd been under the wing of that company ever since I was fresh out of high school, earning a bunch of credentials and putting my heart and soul into the company. The president appreciated my hustle, and within 8 years of joining, I'd become his right-hand woman. I often wish a bright gal like you would snag my son,
the president once said. I was probably thrilled by the faith he had in me. I held the president in high regard, and I figured that his son, who I also admired, would be just as wonderful. But boy, was I off the mark. When I met the president's son, George, at a matchmaking event, he was all smiles.
You are indeed a wonderful person, just like my father has described.
Things were all hunky-dory, and after we exchanged vows and officially became Mr. and Mrs., he did a total 180 on me. Our honeymoon spot was Greece.
I'm beat. If you want to do the tourist thing, go on your own.
Every day he would laze about on the bed and shoo me out of the hotel room. So, bewildered, I hit the streets alone. I figured I could still have a blast by myself, so I went with the flow. However, when I got back to the hotel room after doing the rounds, he had the audacity to snap at me.
Where have you been goofing off? You left your husband hanging and didn't even fetch a keepsake?
He had the gall to say something so outlandish after booting me out of the room himself. The room was thick with a potent, sweet smell. Perfume? Cigarettes? Either way, I was scared of George, who had morphed into a stranger on our honeymoon. I tried my darndest to get through the honeymoon without a hitch, all the while on high alert about his mental state. Yet he kept saying horrible things like,
I don't feel like playing tourist when I'm with you. Even my meals taste off when I look at your face.
When I mustered up the nerve and asked, Why are you being so mean? You never acted this way before we got married. He shot me a nasty look and retorted,
You think I had the option to not marry you when my old man was the one who set us up? I was cornered into this marriage. I couldn't bail on the engagement, but I don't like you. You'd better grovel and suck up to me as much as you can.
I was stunned and stood there, eyes wide open. The president told me,
If my son isn't your cup of tea, feel free to take a pass.
That kind of took a load off, so I figured, why not give the arranged marriage gig a shot? But it seemed like he didn't share the same chill vibes about our meetup. But to think I cornered him into a shotgun wedding? I certainly didn't twist his arm into marrying me. And I can't picture his dad, the president, saying,
You absolutely must walk down the aisle.
So why the heck would he say such nonsense? Even if I tried to dig deeper, he looked majorly ticked off, even huffed at me, so I decided to zip it. You know, the good old don't poke the bear mentality. Even when I played mute, he'd drop lines like,
Your food is awful,
and
hanging with you is a total drag.
But he clammed up a bit when I kept my trap shut, so I decided to ride the silent wave. Then, after we returned from our honeymoon, he gave me the once-over and said,
You're all quiet and a total bore.
Is he serious? But the only reason I stayed on mute was because his attitude went from bad to worse every time I piped up. I figured I was just dodging that bullet. It's because you get all bent out of shape over every little thing. I stayed hushed on our honeymoon because I didn't want us to squabble in foreign territory. But our honeymoon from hell is history, and we're back on home turf. Now I can vent about him without airing our dirty laundry to the public. When I said that, he grunted.
Huh?
like some cartoon villain itching for a brawl. I couldn't help but think, man, he really has a short fuse. You didn't even want to step foot out of the room on our honeymoon, and after telling me to hit the tourist trail alone, you tossed out snarky comments when I came back. Don't you recall what you said? You told me to go sightseeing, so I did. As I laid out the facts, he prepped to counter, but all he could muster was,
I was strong-armed into this marriage. I didn't want to marry you, so I get to run my mouth.
That was his only defense, and in response, I shot back. That's your best comeback? What are you blabbing about? It's not like you were backed into a corner. The whole reason I buttoned up is because you fly off the handle every time I utter a word. I tried to keep the peace on our honeymoon so you wouldn't kick off and make a scene. Are you stuck in grade school or something? I fired off. He came at me ready to rumble, but I didn't flinch. I actually thought, is this all he's got? All bark and no bite? I wonder if the president knew about his Jekyll and Hyde act when he pitched the marriage idea. If he was in the dark, he must have been head over heels for me to have thrown this proposition my way. If he was in the know, maybe he thought I wouldn't be rattled by this guy. Maybe he figured I could handle him. But honestly, I don't think I can reel this guy in. We're just not on the same wavelength.
Shut up. This is a marriage I didn't sign up for. So you have to forgive any of my screw-ups. If you want to play First Lady, play the quiet game. He blurted, plonking down on the couch. From that moment on, he started giving me the cold shoulder. Our wedded life was off to a rocky start. It took me about a year to realize this was all a massive misunderstanding of his, but during that year he blanked me big time. But he sure didn't hold back on his orders. Food, clothes, bath. He'd bellow these commands at me like he was roaring from the rooftops. All the while I was thinking, I'm more than you, Gopher buddy. But for the time being, I rolled up my sleeves and took care of the chores. So we're both pulling our weight, and I wanted him to pitch in with the housework, but even when I asked him, will you help hang the laundry? He just played with his phone, not even sparing me a glance. I hollered his name like 5 times, but he just tisked loudly and bolted to his room. He slammed the door with such a bang, I could practically feel his annoyance. Was I pushing a bit hard? But if he's not game, he should just say so. I end up having to nag him because he gives me the silent treatment. He was just like that, a total dead weight when it came to chores. But then, when I prep his bath, he gripes. It's lukewarm. And when I dish up his meals, he moans. This tastes terrible. Even about the meals, he'd go, I'm not feeling pasta today. But weirdly enough, he'd drop lines like that just on the days when I'd asked him before hitting the grocery store. Is there something you're craving? But he just blanked me, too wrapped up in his magazine to answer. I figured he might be too engrossed in his read to hear me. So I started hollering his name over and over. But that day, when I tapped his shoulder, he shook me off roughly. Just leave. You're in my way. Seeing him say he wasn't in the pasta mood after all that, I shot him a frosty look. I snatched the plate of food in front of him, wrapped it up, and tossed it in the fridge. Hey, what the hell are you doing? I asked you what you felt like eating, but you just shooed me off and said I was in your way without answering. If you're gonna bellyache about the food, you don't have to eat it. I'll have it for lunch tomorrow, so don't touch it. He shouted, What? You're not gonna feed me? But when I shot him a dirty look and said, You said you're not in the pasta mood, right? Then rustle up your own meal. He pulled a face, yanked a pizza out of the freezer, heated it up, and chowed down. From then on, I decided I'd stop bending over backward for him, and instead start airing out the stuff that was ticking me off. At the same time, I figured I'd pick the brain of someone who was both a CEO and my father-in-law about a certain issue. Mr. President, there's something I'd like to chat about, I said after clocking out. George's dad, who had become even nicer to me since our marriage, asked me with a smile, What's up? Could I ask about something concerning George, if that's okay? Something about George? Is your wedded bliss hitting a rough patch? He probed.
It isn't a major crisis, but there was something he had said that had me on edge. I started to spill. I didn't tell him about how his son had been so grouchy since our honeymoon that it was obvious to all, or how he'd been barking at me and his attitude was through the roof. That was another story. Are you thinking about handing George the reins of this company? I put it to him. He looked dumbfounded, then burst into laughter.
Why would you think that? He's clocking hours at a firm in a different industry, and it seems like he wants to chart a different course. He's not with this company, so I never thought about passing him the baton.
That makes sense. It was something I could have pieced together with a little noodling, but every time George had a few cocktails, he'd always spout the same lines to me.
If you keep puffing up your chest around me, I'll kick you to the curb before I even become the big shot. You only married me because you wanted to be the next CEO's wife, didn't you? If you're trying to butter up my dad, don't you dare grouse about what I do. Remember, you're one step down.
He'd often run off at the mouth with stuff like this when he was drunk. Then he'd ramble on about how he's just clocking time at another company because someday he'll be summoned back to his dad's business. He even boasted that he'd be the next CEO when that day came. So while I kept dismissing this as impossible, I decided to fact-check with my father-in-law. At first, he just cracked up, but when he pondered why I was lobbing such a question at him, it seemed like he quickly twigged to the fact his son must have said something off.
Does George really believe he's going to be the next CEO?
He asked, his face turning serious, to which I just nodded. Looks that way. When he stumbles in drunk, he chews me out and throws lines like,
I'm going to be the next CEO, so if you want to be a CEO's wife in one piece, quit the belly aching.
I admitted. The raw call of his flaws doesn't stop there, but just that snippet made my father-in-law furrow his brow and look ticked off.
I'm sorry, Carrie. My son has been a pain. Maybe I should head home and give him a piece of my mind.
But I quickly reined him in. Please, hold off. All I wanted was to verify that he isn't in line to be the next CEO. Please don't rush off to confront him. He cocked his head, thrown as to why I was reining him in, but I had one more query to put to my father-in-law. Michael, I know it's seriously impolite to ask this, especially after you played matchmaker, but...
Fire away.
If I were to say I want a divorce from George, would he object? He rubbed his chin, mulled it over, then shook his head.
You're a top-notch secretary and a fantastic wife. It would be a crying shame if you wanted a divorce. But there must be grounds for you to consider parting ways with George. You're not someone who would drop such a bombshell without cause. If it comes to that, I'll make him eat humble pie, even if I have to twist his arm. But I won't stand in your way if you want a divorce.
Hearing him put it that way, I heaved a sigh of relief. If Michael wasn't going to rail against my move, I thought he might even back my game plan. So I laid out what I had up my sleeve. His face flamed up with rage, and then he looked remorseful, but when I finished my spiel, he said,
I've got your back.
Months zipped by, and before I knew it, George and I had chalked up a year of wedded bliss. But I had zero plans of extending this run, so I declared, I'm heading back to my folks' place starting tomorrow. This was the first time I had dropped a bombshell like this, but even though I was clearly more steamed than usual, he just lounged on the couch watching a comedy show. Finally, without even glancing my way, he said,
I'm beat. Don't talk to me. The work I'm doing is a whole other ballgame from your chores. After all, I'm clocking time at another firm to become the next CEO.
He pushed it that far. I can't stomach him anymore. His pipe dreams and his high and mighty attitude are all reasons for him to take a hike. But he probably won't get the message until he's slapped with the facts. I had already packed my bags, so I hightailed it back to my parents' house. Like any other day, I clocked into work and Michael told me.
Just as we figured, my son came running to me, tears streaming down his face. Quite a sight, considering he usually struts around with such bravado.
I couldn't help but let a smile creep across my face, my cheeks easing into it before I even realized. I suppose I must have been itching to give him a taste of his own medicine this whole time. Over the past year, he's been puffing out his chest, looking down his nose at me, and acting like an overgrown toddler. I wanted to give this big kid a hefty dose of reality. Specifically, I asked my father-in-law to tell George the cold, hard truth. He's not in line to be the CEO. With his imagined future CEO title being the backbone of his pride, when that dream was crushed, he likely scampered off, sobbing, to his dad.
Why on earth did he think he could become our company's CEO even though he's working in a totally different field? You know what he said when I asked him? He thought that because the company he works for is owned by my friend, his work performance would trickle back to me through my friend, and he was convinced that he'd be picked as the next CEO.
Wow, that's some warped logic.
I'm with you. I've never heard a peep about his performance from my friend, and I laid it out for him that I just don't see him as CEO material. He had a good cry, and then hightailed it out of there.
Poor George must have felt like his pride was shattered into a million little pieces. Running off in tears is a reasonable response, I guess. When I checked my phone after my shift, I had a staggering 30 missed calls, all from George. He probably wanted to let off steam at me because he won't be the next CEO, and his pride was broken. But I had already mailed him a document via certified mail, demanding payback for his indiscretions, complete with photocopies of pictures and other evidence. The document instructed him to deal with me through a lawyer, so there was no need for me to listen to his voice firsthand. On my commute home that day, I pulled the plug on my phone plan and made up my mind to ignore George's calls. After all, he had brushed off my words for an entire year, so he can't grumble about getting the silent treatment now. Besides, I've already spilled the beans to my father-in-law about his affair. When I told him, "Please don't say anything to George," it was because I was still in the middle of rounding up proof of the affair and wanted to keep George none the wiser. Thanks to my father-in-law's staying mum, I was able to amass quite a collection of evidence. The thing that got his folks' blood boiling the most was that he had whisked his side piece off to Greece, our honeymoon spot, and snuck her into our hotel room when I was out. The potent, sweet scent I picked up on when I got back to the hotel was apparently the woman's perfume. In retrospect, I wonder if he deliberately left the perfume scent to stir the pot. George, who had been slapped with a demand for compensation for his affair and had talked with a lawyer, supposedly said,
"If we get a divorce, my dad will flip. This is a strategic marriage."
But the lawyer, who had been clued in by me and my father-in-law, told him,
"That's not the case. Your dad simply introduced you and Carrie. There were no secret motives behind your match. You claim it's tactical, but there's no perk for Carrie being wed to you, and there's nothing particularly beneficial for you by being married to Carrie." Huh?
It seems the lawyer dug a little deeper. George blurted out that since I was an employee of my father-in-law's company, he thought his dad was trying to pair him up with me to control the company from within, figuring the more game pieces, the merrier. He was convinced that if he were the CEO and his wife an employee, he could manage the company more effectively. What in the world does he think the company is? Even if he'd been with his dad's company from the get-go, there's no way my father-in-law would ever see such a numbskull as his successor. After all, his company has always been about rewarding talent and never chose a CEO based on family ties. Turns out, George wound up flat broke after paying me the settlement. Since we kept our wallets separate, we agreed there was no need to split assets. Of course, I sought compensation from his mistress too, but she seems to have vanished into thin air after that. She slapped George smack dab in the middle of a bustling street, calling him a fraud for not being the future CEO, and then kicked him to the curb. He later sent me a letter full of corny lines like, "Let's turn over a new leaf. You're the only one for me." My father-in-law stumbled upon it and told George, "Instead of penning nonsense like this, you should do some soul-searching." He was shipped off to his parents' place, where he's apparently undergoing some intensive character building. Here's hoping he matures and turns into a respectable adult who can tie the knot. But even if he does become a decent guy, I wouldn't dream of marrying him again. By the way, as a mea culpa for all the headaches caused by his good-for-nothing son, Michael has offered to introduce me to a reliable guy. This time, I plan to thoroughly vet who I'm getting into a relationship with before saying I do.